The Foreign Policy of President Ronald Reagan by Chas Stackpole and Jackson Baker.
The Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, was created on March 23, 1983 by President Ronald Reagan. Its purpose was to develop an anti-ballistic missile system that would prevent attacks from other countries, primarily the Soviet Union. Some were worried about the program contravening the anti-ballistic missile agreement of the Strategic Arms Limitation talks years before. One clause of the agreement stated that both countries would limit the number of facilities protected by an anti-ballistic missile system to just 2 each.
Because of this, along with budget issues, the project was pushed to the side. Some of the theoretical weapons included space and ground-based nuclear X-ray lasers, subatomic particle beams, and the computer-guided projectiles fired by electromagnetic railguns, all under the central control of a supercomputer system. This kind of intricate system would require a lot of power, so nuclear power was the goal. But as the reality of multiple nuclear plants became less feasible, so did the futuristic designs. Eventually, the main goal was to develop guided missile projectiles. $30 billion was invested into this project, and later the SDI was abandoned.
In the mid-1980s, the Soviet economy was struggling to keep up with Reagan and his military buildup. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the head of the Communist Party. A year later, at the 27th Party Congress, Gorbachev made 2 proposals. The first was perestroika, which was a restructuring of the economy. It would pave the way for privatization of farming and industry, the creation of profit incentives, and a market system for setting prices and governing internal trade.
In addition was glasnost, which means openness in Russian. The idea was to be open to discussion of social and political issues. Moreover, it would ease censorship controls and create new personal freedoms. The people liked these ideas, but the Soviet Union needed the Cold War to slow down because it was draining their money. This would later on contribute to their collapse. And although Reagan welcomed new overtures from the Soviet Union for peace and cooperation, he also remained wary and continued to build up the U.S. defenses so that any negotiations that followed could be initiated from a position of strength.
In June of 1945, the Yalta and Potsdam agreements split Berlin into similar sectors. The Soviets took the eastern half, while the Allies took the western. The future goal of the Soviets was to drive the United States, France, and Britain out of the city for good. To accomplish this, the Soviets made a blockade of West Berlin to starve the Allies out of the city. Instead of being pushed out, the United States and the other Allies figured out ways to bring in supplies to their sectors. Using what they called the Berlin Airlift, the Allies flew in their supplies so that they could avoid the hostility of the Soviet Union. This lasted for more than a year and ended up supplying more than 2.3 million tons of food, fuels, and other goods to a needy West Berlin. In 1949, the Soviets called off the blockade.
On August 13, 1961, the communist government of the German Democratic Republic began to build a barbed wire and concrete wall that would stretch across East and West Berlin. Nearly 30 years after the construction of what would come to be known as the Berlin Wall, in June of 1987, President Reagan stood before the Brandenburg Gate and challenged the Soviet leader, exclaiming, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall."
Eventually, the wall was taken down on November 9, 1989, when the head of the East German Communist Party announced that citizens of the German Democratic Republic could cross the border whenever they pleased. Many citizens brought hammers and picks to begin tearing the wall down.
While the Soviet Union collapsed because of internal problems, President Reagan certainly helped speed up the process. One of Reagan's pressures was his defense buildup in the U.S. In 1980, only $134 billion was budgeted for defense. By comparison, in 1989, the U.S.'s defense spending equaled a whopping $253 billion. This change raised defense spending to 7% of the gross domestic product, or GDP. This pressured the Soviets into raising their defense from spending from 22% to 27% of their GDP, while they should have been devoting more funding to other facets, for example, the food shortages brought on by Carter's grain embargo.
Another way Reagan weakened the Soviet Union was through economic means. He reduced Western technology imports and limited Soviet natural gas exports to Western Europe. However, what was perhaps his most effective method was the drastic drop in the price of oil that he helped bring about in the 1980s, yet another costly blow to the Soviet economy. On May 31, 1988, at Moscow State University, Reagan gave a speech about democracy, individual freedom, and free enterprise. Reagan inspired the youth with a passionate speech.
Your generation is living in one of the most exciting, hopeful times in Soviet history. It is a time when the first breath of freedom stirs the air and the heart beats to the accelerated rhythm of hope, when the accumulated spiritual energies of a long silence yearn to break free.
A man named Natan Sharansky was living in an 8 by 10 foot Siberian prison cell when his guards permitted him to read Kavda, which was the official communist newspaper. Not surprisingly, the front page condemned Reagan for calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. The prisoners were able to communicate with each other by talking through the toilets and tapping on the walls, and word quickly spread about Reagan's bold statement. As Sharansky put it, the leader of the free world has spoken the truth, a truth that burned inside the heart of each and every one of us. Lech Walesa, the founder of the Solidarity movement that brought down communism in Poland and prepared the way for the end of communism throughout Eastern and Central Europe, put his feelings about Reagan simply: "We in Poland owe him our liberty."
Reagan was an immensely important part of U.S. history. His idea to start the Strategic Defense Initiative may not have gone completely according to plan, but his ingenuity and vision for the future, especially when it came to foreign policy, was unparalleled. And it can't be forgotten that the SDI, while eventually scrapped, played a key role in pressuring the Soviets into expending more resources than they had, which led to their downfall. His bold and fearless challenge to General Secretary Gorbachev was something that no previous president had ever had the strength to do, and it paid off when an entire city of people was liberated. In summary, President Ronald Reagan was an American hero unlike any other, whose actions and decisions in foreign policy shaped all of U.S. history.